August 15, 1940. Southern England, RAF Northolt. Witold Urbanowicz sat in the cockpit of a Hurricane Mark, 27 years old, 312 hours of combat flight time logged, waiting for a scramble order that the senior RAF controllers were still debating whether to route through him at all. The Polish pilots of 303 Squadron had been in Britain for less than 3 months. They had been assigned training roles, evaluated as undisciplined. Their English was functional at best. Their methods were considered irregular. Several RAF officers had formally questioned whether they were ready for frontline deployment. That morning, 150 German aircraft were inbound across the Channel. Heinkel HE 111s, Dornier DO 7s, escorted, organized, on a confirmed strike path toward RAF airfields. 303 Squadron was cleared for intercept at 11:04 a.m. By the time the debrief was filed, Urbanowicz had downed his first confirmed kill of the Battle of Britain. It would not be his last, not by a wide margin. What happened over the next 6 weeks would force the RAF to reclassify everything they thought they knew about him. Witold Urbanowicz was not the kind of officer who asked for acknowledgement. By the summer of 1940, he held the rank of flight lieutenant in the Polish Air Force, a rank earned across 14 years of service, not inherited, not accelerated by connection or circumstance. He had entered the Polish Air Force Academy in Dęblin in 1930. He graduated, he stayed, he instructed. By the mid-1930s, he was teaching other men how to fly. Not as a transitional role, not as a holding pattern between postings, but as a deliberate assignment given to pilots whose technical precision was considered above average and whose situational awareness in the air had been formally noted in evaluation reports. That detail matters, because instructors do not just teach maneuvers. They watch other pilots make decisions under pressure. They develop a diagnostic eye. They learn faster than most exactly where the gap is between a pilot who understands a procedure and a pilot who understands a situation. Urbanowicz spent years in that gap, studying it, cataloging it, without ever announcing that he was doing so. When Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, Urbanowicz was 27 years old. He flew combat sorties in the defensive campaign that followed. The campaign lasted 35 days. Poland was fighting on 2 fronts simultaneously. Germany from the west, the Soviet Union from the east after September 17th. The Polish Air Force was outnumbered in aircraft, outmatched in production capacity, and operating from airfields that were being systematically eliminated from the first morning of the war. By the time the campaign collapsed, Urbanowicz had logged operational combat hours under conditions that most RAF pilots in 1940 had not yet encountered and would not encounter until the situation over Britain became critical. He escaped through Romania, then France, then across the Channel. He arrived in Britain in late 1939 as part of the first wave of Polish airmen who had made their way west after the fall of Poland. There were several hundred of them. The RAF processed them, assessed them, and made a collective institutional decision that would define the first 8 months of their time in Britain. They would not be deployed in frontline combat roles until they had completed RAF training programs and demonstrated proficiency according to RAF standards. On paper, that decision was defensible. The RAF had its own procedures, its own communication protocols, its own tactical doctrine. Polish pilots, regardless of their experience, needed to be integrated into a functioning system, not inserted into it as a disruptive variable. In practice, the decision meant that men with combat experience were placed in training pipelines alongside pilots who had never fired a weapon from a moving aircraft. They flew the same evaluation circuits, sat through the same procedural briefings, were assessed by the same criteria applied to pilots a decade younger with a fraction of their hours. The friction was not always subtle. Polish pilots were frequently described in RAF internal assessments as aggressive, difficult to manage, and resistant to standardized formation flying. Their English for most was limited, functional in the air, strained on the ground. Social integration into RAF station life was uneven. There were postings where Polish airmen were tolerated professionally but excluded informally. Mess dinners attended in silence. Briefings where questions from Polish officers were fielded with visible impatience. Urbanowicz registered all of it. He made no record of being offended by any of it. What he did instead was study. He studied RAF tactics with the same diagnostic attention he had applied as an instructor. He studied the Hurricane, its handling characteristics, its turning radius at altitude, its performance envelope in a dive. He studied reports on Luftwaffe bomber formations, the tight defensive configurations the Germans used, the positioning of gunners, the angles of approach that minimized exposure. He was studying a problem that no one had yet formally assigned to him, because no one had yet formally decided he was qualified to solve it. In June 1940, 303 Squadron was officially formed at RAF Northolt. It was a Polish fighter squadron, staffed primarily by Polish pilots, commanded initially by a British officer, squadron leader Ronald Kellett, with a Polish deputy. Urbanowicz was assigned as one of the flight commanders. The squadron was designated for training, not deployment. The RAF's position was that 303 needed additional preparation before it could be committed to frontline operations. That position would last exactly as long as it took for one of those pilots to prove it wrong. Urbanowicz had 14 years of logged experience, a combat record from a war the RAF had not fought in, and a habit of solving problems no one had asked him to look at yet. The question was never whether he was ready. The question was whether the situation would become desperate enough for it to matter. By July 1940, the RAF was losing pilots faster than it could replace them. That is not a rhetorical statement. It is an operational fact that Fighter Command's own internal assessments were documenting in real time. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding had been tracking the attrition rate since the fall of France, and what the numbers showed was not a crisis approaching. It was a crisis already in progress. Between May 10th and June 4th, during the Dunkirk evacuation alone, Fighter Command had lost 106 pilots killed or missing. 67 more were wounded and out of rotation. By the time the Battle of Britain formally began on July 10th, Dowding was operating with a pilot deficit he had already flagged to the Air Ministry in writing. The training pipeline could not close the gap. A replacement pilot in the summer of 1940 was completing his operational training in as little as 2 weeks before being assigned to a frontline squadron. 2 weeks. Against opponents who had been flying coordinated combat missions since Spain, since Poland, since France. The Luftwaffe's experienced corps, the pilots who had logged kills across 3 prior campaigns, were not learning the job. They had already learned it. They arrived over Britain with established habits, established formations, and an established understanding of how to survive an engagement and still complete the mission. The standard RAF intercept doctrine was not designed for what the Luftwaffe was deploying. The German bomber formations were the central problem. Heinkel HE 100s 11s and Dornier DO7s flew in tight defensive clusters, staggered altitudes, overlapping fields of fire from their gunners, escorts positioned to respond to any attack vector that exposed the bombers. The doctrine RAF squadrons had trained on assumed a more dispersed target. It assumed that formation integrity could be disrupted at range, that bombers could be peeled away from their escorts and engaged individually. What RAF pilots were finding, repeatedly, was that attacking a tight German formation at the angles prescribed by pre-war intercept doctrine meant flying directly into concentrated defensive fire for an extended approach. The casualty pattern reflected this. Pilots were not being lost exclusively in dogfights with German fighters. They were being lost on bomber intercepts, on the approach before they had even fired. The geometry of the standard attack was costing time and exposure that pilots with 2 weeks of operational training could not absorb and survive. Fighter Command issued updated tactical guidance. Squadrons were advised to break formation integrity before engaging. Wing attacks were discussed at the command level. Larger numbers of RAF fighters coordinated to overwhelm the German defensive screen. Practice. The coordination required for wing-level attacks was difficult to execute against fast-moving formations with unpredictable routing. By the time 3 squadrons could be assembled and vectored onto a target, the target had often already reached its objective or turned for home. The pressure on sector controllers was compounding. Radar gave Fighter Command early warning. That advantage was real and it mattered. But radar showed numbers and direction. It did not show formation depth, altitude variance, or escort positioning. Controllers were making intercept decisions based on incomplete information, routing squadrons onto contact under time constraints that left little margin for adjustment once the pilots were airborne. If the intercept vector was wrong, there was rarely enough fuel to reposition. Dowding understood the arithmetic. He was managing it consciously, deliberately rationing his squadrons to prevent total collapse, keeping certain units in reserve, rotating exhausted pilots where rotation was possible. It was a coherent strategy under impossible conditions, but it was also a strategy that required every available asset to perform at maximum efficiency, and not every asset was being used. At RAF Northolt, 303 Squadron was still in its training designation, still flying evaluation circuits, still being assessed. The pilots in that squadron had, collectively, more combat hours than most of the frontline units currently being rotated through the southern sectors. They had flown against the Luftwaffe already, not in exercises, in Poland, in France, against the same aircraft types, the same formations, the same tactical patterns now appearing over southern England. That experience was sitting on the ground. On August 2, 1940, during a routine training flight, one of 303 Squadron's Polish pilots broke formation to engage a German aircraft that had appeared within range. He had not been cleared to engage. He acted on instinct, or more, precisely on a set of reflexes developed across months of actual combat. He downed the aircraft. The RAF's response to that incident, what it triggered, what it forced, what it could no longer administratively justify ignoring, would change the squadron's status within days. But being cleared for deployment and being trusted with the hardest assignments were 2 different things. And Urbanowicz was about to find out exactly where that line was drawn. 303 Squadron was cleared for frontline operations on August 31, 1940. The timing was not a reward, it was a recalculation. Fighter Command's attrition had reached a point where the administrative justification for keeping experienced pilots in a training designation could no longer be sustained against the operational reality of what was happening in the skies over southern England. Dowding needed pilots who could function. 303 Squadron had them. The designation changed. Urbanowicz flew his first operational sortie for the RAF that same week. The conditions were not favorable. Late August over southern England carried a specific kind of weather. Overcast at irregular altitudes, broken cloud layers that compressed visibility into unpredictable corridors. Pilots operating in those conditions could not rely on a clean horizon. Depth perception at altitude, already a managed variable in clear skies, became a calculation rather than an instinct. The cloud cover that made intercepts harder also made it easier for German formations to approach undetected until they were already inside the engagement window. Radar could track them to a point. Below certain altitudes, in certain weather, the picture got thin. On the morning of September 2, 1940, Urbanowicz was airborne over the Thames estuary as part of a 303 squadron patrol. The briefing had been routine in its structure: intercept vector, altitude assignment, radio protocol. Cloud Base was sitting at approximately 3,000 feet in the operational area. Visibility between layers was variable. The patrol was vectored onto a reported formation of German bombers, inbound from the southeast. What the vector did not account for was the cloud geometry. The formation, when 303 Squadron made visual contact, was already inside the outer edge of its attack window. The bombers, Heinkel HE-111s, a cluster of 9 aircraft in their standard defensive configuration, were using the cloud layer as a ceiling, flying low enough beneath it to complicate approach angles from above. The escort fighters that should have been visible on the flanks were either absent or had not yet been picked up. There was no time to reassess the intercept geometry and reapproach. The engagement was happening now on the terms the current position dictated. Urbanowicz assessed the formation in the seconds available to him. The standard approach, a direct vector onto the formation's lead aircraft, was what the bomber's gunners were configured to defend against. The He-111's defensive armament was positioned to concentrate fire along the approach axis. A pilot coming in straight, at speed, on the nose of the formation was flying into a prepared field of fire for the duration of his approach. Against a pilot with 2 weeks of operational experience, that geometry was frequently decisive. Against a pilot who had studied it, who had cataloged exactly where the coverage was thickest and where it thinned, it was a problem with a solution. The solution was angle. Urbanowicz did not attack the formation from the front. He came in from the lower rear quarter, a vector that placed him outside the optimal coverage arc of the He-111's rear gunner, required a shorter exposure time on approach, and allowed him to close to effective firing range before the defensive calculation could fully adjust. It was not a complicated maneuver. It did not require exceptional reflexes. It required knowing the coverage geometry of that specific aircraft well enough to exploit the one angle where the margin was thinnest. He closed to approximately 150 yards. He fired in a controlled burst. The HE-111 broke from the formation. The subsequent RAF combat report logged it as a probable. The aircraft was observed to leave formation with visible damage and descend through the cloud layer. No confirmation of crash site. By the formal accounting of Fighter Command's kill criteria, it sat in the middle category. Not a confirmed kill, not a miss. Urbanowicz filed his report. He listed the approach vector, the firing range, the observed result. He did not editorialize. He did not note that the attack angle he had used was not the one specified in standard RAF intercept doctrine. He wrote what happened, in the sequence it happened, in the language the form required. The debrief officer noted the approach angle, asked about it once. Urbanowicz explained the coverage geometry of the He-111's rear defensive position in 2 sentences. The debrief officer made a note. The conversation moved on. What the report did not capture, what no report from that period was designed to capture, was that Urbanowicz had just demonstrated, quietly and without announcement, that he had already solved a problem the RAF was still in the process of formally identifying. But a single probable kill on a patrol intercept proved nothing to the men making assignment decisions. What came next would be harder to dismiss. The Luftwaffe was not a static opponent. That point is worth stating plainly, because it is the point that determined everything that followed. The German air campaign over Britain in the summer and autumn of 1940 was not a fixed tactical problem. It was an adjusting one. Luftwaffe commanders were receiving after-action reports from every mission. They were tracking which formations were being hit, at which altitudes, on which approach vectors, by which intercept patterns. They were making changes, not slowly, not bureaucratically. With the operational tempo of a force that had been refining its methods across 3 prior campaigns and understood that the margin between mission success and unacceptable loss rates was a problem of geometry, not courage. By the second week of September 1940, the changes were visible to anyone paying attention. The first adjustment was escort positioning. Earlier in the campaign, German fighter escorts had been operating with relative freedom, flying ahead of the bomber formations, engaging RAF interceptors before they could reach effective range. The arrangement suited the fighter pilots but had produced a specific failure. Bombers were reaching their targets damaged, and, in several documented cases, without adequate close protection when RAF squadrons broke through the forward screen. Luftwaffe command responded by pulling the escorts tighter. Messerschmitt Bf-109s were now flying in close formation with the bombers, directly above, on the flanks, sometimes staggered below. The freedom of movement that had made the escort role effective for the fighter pilots was deliberately constrained in order to provide continuous coverage for the formation. The effect on RAF intercepts was immediate. The approach angles that had been viable in late August were now entering fighter coverage before they reached bomber range. The lower rear quarter approach, the geometry Urbanowicz had used on September 2nd, was now consistently occupied by escort elements. What had been a thin margin in the defensive coverage had been identified, studied, and filled. The second adjustment was altitude variance. German formations had been flying at relatively predictable altitudes, high enough to complicate ground-based defenses, consistent enough to allow fuel and timing calculations across the channel crossing. Through the second week of September, formations began varying their operational altitude more aggressively. Some elements flew higher, drawing RAF squadrons into thinner air where the Hurricane's performance degraded. Others came in lower, compressing the intercept window by reducing the time between radar acquisition and target engagement. The variance was not dramatic on any individual mission. Across multiple missions, it meant that sector controllers were routing squadrons onto contacts with less reliable altitude data, and pilots were arriving at intercept points to find the geometry different from the briefing. The third adjustment was timing compression. Formations were crossing the channel at shorter intervals. The intent was straightforward: to prevent fighter command from landing, refueling, and rearming between intercepts. A squadron that had just completed an engagement and returned to base needed a minimum of 20 minutes on the ground before it could be effectively redeployed. If the next formation arrived before that window closed, the squadron was either scrambled with partial fuel loads or held on the ground and replaced by a unit that had not yet been in the air that day. Either outcome degraded fighter command's available response at any given moment. For Urbanowicz, these changes created a specific problem. His first successful engagement had been built on a tactical solution derived from known geometry. He had studied the HE-111's defensive coverage, identified its thinnest angle, and attacked along that vector with sufficient precision to make the approach viable. That solution had a shelf life. The Luftwaffe had adjusted its escort positioning in direct response to the pattern of attacks its formations had been absorbing. The angle that had worked on September 2nd was now covered. The next engagement would not be a known geometry problem. It would be a real-time decision problem, assessed in the seconds available between visual contact and firing range, with incomplete information, against an opponent who was actively defending against the last solution. This is where the nature of the contest shifted. Skill in the air, the mechanical ability to place an aircraft where it needed to be and fire accurately, was a threshold requirement. Every pilot still flying in September 1940 had cleared that threshold. What separated the pilots who were accumulating kills from the pilots who were being lost was something less visible and considerably harder to teach: the ability to assess a situation that did not match the briefing, discard the prepared solution, and construct a new one in the time available before the margin closed entirely. Urbanowicz had been developing that ability for 14 years. The Luftwaffe had just made it the only ability that mattered. But adapting to a changing problem in isolation was one thing. What was coming next would test whether that adaptation could hold when the enemy stopped adjusting formations and started targeting the pilots solving them. By the third week of September 1940, the math had changed in a specific way. It was no longer sufficient for Urbanowicz to find the right angle on a formation and execute a clean intercept. The formations had adjusted, the escort coverage had tightened, the altitude variance had complicated the approach geometry. Every tactical solution he had used in the first 2 weeks of operational flying had either been closed off or made significantly more expensive in terms of exposure time and risk. The problem had been reset, and the reset had not been accidental. What the Luftwaffe's experienced escort pilots had begun doing, not as a formal directive, but as the organic product of experienced fighter pilots recognizing a pattern, was isolating the RAF pilots who were consistently making contact with the bombers. The logic was straightforward. A pilot who reaches the bombers is a pilot who has found a way through the escort screen. A pilot who finds that way once will find it again. The correct response is not to reinforce the screen uniformly. It is to identify where the penetration is occurring and make that approach vector cost more than any pilot is willing to pay. The mechanism for doing that was bait. A damaged or separated bomber, real or apparently so, was one of the most reliable triggers in the aerial combat environment of 1940. Every RAF pilot understood his mission as the destruction of German bombers before they reached their targets. A bomber that appeared to be struggling, separated from its formation, trailing smoke or flying at reduced speed, represented exactly the kind of clean engagement opportunity that the tight escort formations had been denying for weeks. The instinct to pursue it was not irrational. It was the correct instinct in most circumstances. In the duel phase, it became a mechanism for reversal. The setup was documented in multiple RAF combat reports from this period, described in varying detail depending on how much of it the pilot reporting had survived long enough to understand. A bomber element would separate from the main formation, not dramatically, not in obvious distress, but enough to appear isolated and vulnerable. The separation drew pursuing RAF fighters away from the main formation, away from whatever squadron support was available, and into a lateral position relative to the escort fighters flying high cover. The escort pilots, holding altitude and position, had a targeting solution on any RAF fighter that committed to the pursuit before the geometry became clear. The window between recognition and consequence was measured in seconds. Urbanowicz encountered this pattern for the first time on September 18, 1940, over the Thames estuary at approximately 15,000 feet. He had made visual contact with what appeared to be a Dornier DO-17 that had separated from a formation tracking northwest. The aircraft was flying a slightly irregular heading, not the clean, straight-line routing of a formation element, but the subtly corrected track of an aircraft managing a problem. At the range of initial contact, approximately 800 yards, the read was consistent with a damaged aircraft attempting to maintain altitude and course. He closed to 600 yards before the geometry clarified. The Dornier's heading had been bringing him laterally across the nose of two Bf-109s, holding position 2,000 feet above and slightly behind his current track. They had been there when he first made visual contact. At 800 yards, against a target he was focusing on, in the compressed time frame of an intercept approach, they had not registered as the primary threat. At 600 yards, with the angular geometry of their positioning now visible against the cloud layer, the setup was unambiguous. He broke off. The break was immediate and hard. A diving turn away from the Dornier's track that put him below and outside the 109's optimal attack vector. He lost altitude. He lost the engagement. He lost the probable kill that the Dornier had appeared to represent. What he did not lose was the 2 seconds of decision time that the recognition had bought him, and he spent those 2 seconds correctly. One of the 109s followed him through the break. The pursuit lasted approximately 90 seconds before Urbanowicz extended the dive and opened enough separation to make the engagement unprofitable. The 109 broke off. No shots were fired by either aircraft. He returned to Northolt, filed his report, described the positioning of the escort elements, the heading of the Dornier, the geometry of the setup as he had reconstructed it. He noted the approximate altitude differential of the 109s at initial contact and the angular range at which the setup had become identifiable. He was describing a repeatable trap. And in describing it with that precision, he was already thinking about how to use it. Because the dual phase had not shown Urbanowicz that the Luftwaffe could set traps. It had shown him that traps worked in both directions, and that he was now experienced enough to build one. The report Urbanowicz filed after September 18th sat in the 303 Squadron intelligence log for 4 days before it produced anything actionable. That was not unusual. The volume of combat reports being processed through Fighter Command's sector stations in September 1940 was significant. Multiple squadrons, multiple engagements daily, each generating documentation that needed to be cross-referenced against radar logs, Observer Corps reports, and Luftwaffe loss records where those were available. A single pilot's description of an escort positioning pattern was one data point among hundreds being processed simultaneously by intelligence officers who were themselves operating under the same time compression, affecting everyone else in the system. Urbanowicz was not waiting for the intelligence process to catch up with him. He had 4 days of reduced operational tempo. Weather over the southeastern sectors had compressed the number of large-scale German raids, and 303 Squadron sortie rate dropped proportionally. He used the time the same way he had used the training period in the months before deployment, studying a problem no one had formally assigned to him. The problem now was specific. The bait pattern he had encountered on September 18th was not an improvisation. It was too clean, too geometrically precise, to have been assembled spontaneously by escort pilots reacting in real time. It had been planned, which meant it had been used before, which meant there was a pattern in the prior engagement reports if someone looked for it. He looked for it. Cross-referencing 303 Squadron's own combat logs with the debriefs of 2 adjacent squadrons operating in the same sector, he identified 3 prior engagements, logged between September 8th and September 15th, that described a similar geometry. A separated or apparently damaged bomber, RAF fighters committing to pursuit, escort elements in high cover. In 2 of the 3 cases, the RAF pilot reporting the engagement had not identified the setup until after the fact, reconstructing it from the position of the attacking 109s at the moment fire was open. In one case, the pilot had not filed a report at all. He had not returned. The pattern was consistent enough to be reliable, and a reliable pattern had a specific operational value that Urbanowicz had been thinking about since the break on September 18th. It could be reversed. The logic required 3 things to hold simultaneously. First, the bait element, the separated bomber, needed to be real enough that the escort pilots above it would commit to their covering position with confidence. If they detected early that the approaching RAF fighter understood the geometry, they would adjust. The reversal only worked if the trap was allowed to assemble itself completely. Second, the approaching pilot needed to control his own visible behavior precisely enough to appear committed to the pursuit without actually being committed to it. Closing range, maintaining heading, giving the escort pilots above exactly the picture that confirmed their setup was working. Third, the break, when it came, needed to be timed not to the moment of personal recognition, but to the moment the escort pilot's angular position relative to him was at its least advantageous for a pursuit. Too early, and the 109s had enough lateral range to cut across his brake vector. Too late, and the firing solution was already open. The timing window was narrow. Urbanowicz calculated it at approximately 4 seconds. The interval between the point at which the escort pilots would have committed to their attack transition and the point at which their angular geometry gave them a clean pursuit vector on a braking target. 4 seconds of deliberate, visible, false commitment to a trap he had already identified. Then a brake time not to instinct, but to geometry. He tested the concept on September 23, 1940, over Kent. The setup appeared at approximately 14,000 feet. A Heinkel. He 111 on a separated track, flying the same slightly irregular heading he had observed 5 days earlier. He acquired it at 900 yards. He closed. He maintained heading and speed with the visible consistency of a pilot fully committed to the pursuit. At 650 yards, without altering his approach profile in any way that would register as recognition from above, he located the escort elements in his peripheral scan. 2 Bf-109s, high cover, positioned almost identically to the September 18th geometry. He held for 3 more seconds. Then he broke, hard, low, lateral, timed to the moment the 109 seconds angular position placed them at maximum deflection from a clean pursuit vector. Neither aircraft followed him into the break with a viable solution. One attempted a pursuit and abandoned it within 30 seconds. The second did not commit at all. He had walked into a prepared trap, let it close around him, and walked back out of it on his own terms. He had done it not through superior speed, not through superior aircraft performance, but through the patience to let the enemy's plan complete itself while he was already 3 steps ahead of it. The Heinkel, unprotected for the 12 seconds the escort pilots had spent processing what had just happened, was now isolated. Urbanowicz came back around and engaged it from the lower rear quarter. But demonstrating that the trap could be reversed once was not the same as surviving. The moment the Luftwaffe realized someone had decoded it, and the final test was already being scheduled. September 27, 1940, was one of the heaviest raid days of the entire Battle of Britain. The Luftwaffe launched 2 major assault waves, morning and afternoon, across a broad front targeting London and the surrounding sector stations. Fighter Command scrambled every available squadron. The operational picture at the sector control level was described in post-battle assessments as the most compressed of the campaign, multiple formations on simultaneous tracks, escort coverage heavier than any prior engagement, and a sortie tempo that had several squadrons airborne on their 3rd rotation before midday. 303 Squadron was committed on the morning wave. Urbanowicz made contact with a formation of Dornier Do-17s at approximately 17,000 feet over the southeastern outskirts of London. His section had been separated from the main squadron element during the climb. Cloud layers and radio interference had broken the formation before visual contact with the Germans was established. He was effectively alone. No section support. Fuel for approximately 22 minutes of combat operations before the return margin became non-negotiable. The formation in front of him carried close escort, 8 Bf-109s, tight, positioned correctly. He had 1 approach, 1 fuel margin, and a trap he had already reversed twice, against pilots who may or may not have been briefed on what had happened the last time someone tried it against him. He closed anyway. Controlled his profile. Gave the escort pilots above him the picture they expected to see. Held the false commitment longer than he had held it on September 23rd. 1 additional second, because the 109S's positioning was slightly tighter and the geometry required more patience, not less. Then he broke, clean, timed correctly. He came back around and downed 2 Dornier in separate firing passes before his fuel margin closed the engagement. He landed at Northolt, filed his report. The debrief officer noted both kills without visible reaction. He asked one question about the approach geometry on the second pass. Urbanowicz answered it in 2 sentences. The debrief officer wrote it down and moved on to the next pilot. By the end of October 1940, Urbanowicz had 17 confirmed kills. He was the highest-scoring pilot in 303 Squadron. Quietly, without formal announcement, RAF Fighter Command had begun routing the most complex to reflect what the record now showed. The file had simply been updated to reflect what the record now showed. The men who had questioned whether one Polish pilot was ready for frontline deployment were now, without exception, putting him at the front of the line.